Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi. For nearly 2 decades, U.S.-China business and trade relationships were central to the two countries' overall relations. However, in recent years, due to the changing nature of this bilateral relationship now as strategic competitors, as well as COVID-19, many American businesses are reconfiguring their strategy in China. Today, our guest is Ker Gibbs, whose business career in China started in the early 1990s. He was the president of American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, representing American business interests. He finished his term in December of 2021. He just edited the book, Selling to China, Stories of Success, Failure, and Constant Change, which is to be published on August 1st. Welcome, Ker.
Great to be with you, Wenqi.
So why did you decide to edit this book? What do you hope to accomplish during a time when promoting doing business between U.S. and China may not be the most popular idea?
Well, you're right about that. It's not popular, and that's exactly why we felt it was important to do this book. The conversation about China and with China has just become so toxic, and it's really become completely dominated by conversations about the national security issues and Taiwan, of course. And our feeling is that there's really so much more to say about the relationship. And again, it's we want to basically remind people about how important the commercial side of this relationship is and how mutually beneficial it has been over a long period of time. And so that's really the most important point of the book. But second, we want to make the point that actually the commercial side of the relationship can actually be beneficial and play a role in diplomacy, in trying to bring these countries back together. So those are the main points.
And maybe you can elaborate on more what are the benefits, right? Because I think that's the biggest debate, at least in Washington or in the Western world, that in the past 2 decades, maybe we place too much emphasis on commercial benefits. But spell out for us sort of, in addition to financial returns, what are the other benefits that business community is seeing?
Yeah, I mean, it has been mutually beneficial. I think we could talk for a long time about what's happened in China over the last, 20, 30, 40 years and look at, the standard of living that has come up and, a lot of good choices that were made in China that were bringing in foreign businesses that brought higher standards, investment, all of those kinds of things had a tremendous benefit in China.
Yeah, but has that benefited, for example, at home, which is where you and I know that's where the debate sort of originated?
It has. I think it is fair. I mean, that the debate originated, you're exactly right. I mean, I think during the Obama administration is when a lot of that discussion started to happen, where President Obama pointed out, the imbalance in the benefits of that trading relationship. And he was not completely wrong. But I would answer the question this way, especially looking at in the here and the now, because people are talking about the decoupling and what that would look like. Inflation right now in the United States is the number one issue. Everybody is complaining about inflation. And I would say this, if you don't like inflation now, wait until we have a full decoupling with China and see how much you like paying $3,000 for an $800 TV. See how you like that. If you didn't like inflation, you are going to hate decoupling. And so that is something that, again, it's hard to be so specific because people don't buy a television every day. But that's part of what we would be missing. I mean but there's a lot of other aspects to the relationship as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about your book, thanks to you, I had the privilege to have a preview, is that the 7 chapters actually focused on, each one focuses on a particular industry and its own sort of business evolution in China. Can you just kind of briefly share with us, I find it fascinating, for example, the legal industry, right? The education industry, manufacturing, marketing, branding, automobile, entertainment, media, etc. Each one has its own history and can be a book in and of itself. But just share with us sort of, how, why you picked those 7 industries and, quickly sort of their own evolutions.
Sure. What I was really going for there is diversity. And I was also going for industries that had applicable lessons across businesses. In other words, if you just take automotive as an example, automotive is all about advanced manufacturing, but it's also about branding and marketing and customer experience. And if you're running that business in China, it's also about government relations, which is really a key point. I really wanted to bring out that part of doing business in China. And what the common theme between the chapters, between all 7 chapters, and I want to be clear, this is not a book about all aspects of business in China. There's a lot more going on in China that's not covered in this book. It's not about entrepreneurs. It's not about SMEs, the small, medium businesses. This is about large foreign businesses that are operating in China. So it's just that slice. And so I picked different authors that, as you point out, were able to discuss what's going on in their specific industry.
And I also find it fascinating, right? So the American business community historically played a significant role in influencing U.S.-China relations. And China's entry into the WTO, U.S. support for China to be better integrated into the global system was to a large part, thanks to American business community's lobbying in Washington, D.C. over the 2 decades or so. But right now, it feels that the business community's voice doesn't carry as much weight. And the business community feels very frustrated with Washington, D.C.'s decision-making. So what do you think actually happened to make this attitude change?
Yeah, I think that's true, that there is some frustration and there is less of a dialogue in Washington, D.C. But I don't think it's because people in D.C. are not listening. I still talk to people in Washington, D.C. And I think it's more a question that the issues have shifted. So right now, the main issues between China are actually not about trade or the imbalance of trade and intellectual property. It's all about national security. And so the conversation has shifted more. And so we have, less of a discussion. Again, back to the point of the book is we're trying to bring commerce back into that discussion. The frustration, there is frustration in the business community, but I think it's more a frustration with the situation as opposed to, specific individuals. It's a very troublesome situation right now between the United States and China for sure.
And say more about the situation. What does that mean?
Well, it's again, I think it's I guess to go all the way back to the Obama years, which again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when this shift took place, but roughly, I mean, that's certainly when the discussion about engagement and the failure of engagement started to becoming more prevalent and it was President Obama.
Was it also actually curious? Was it also
Sure.
because American businesses started complaining about their frustration in terms of access to market in China and all these other issues, and so that was sort of making the change, or what were the other possibilities?
Yeah, I think the market access issues have always been there. That sort of predates Obama, but I think Obama really pointed out the imbalance in benefits and the imbalance in trade, and also President Obama really made a big issue about the intellectual property theft and the government-sponsored intellectual property theft, and that was a big issue during the Obama administration. And overall, he was just pointing out that the benefits weren't balanced. And having said that, through those years, you could say that China changed as well. You could also say the United States changed. You could say both. And I think that the U.S. certainly changed in the sense that President Obama had a hard time sort of selling the idea of trade and globalization. And that was a big frustration for all of us in the business community, especially me representing the global businesses. And frankly, we did the best we could to work with the administration to try to sell TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we were trying to explain to the American people the benefits of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the benefits of globalization and trade in general. On TPP, we failed. He failed, we failed, America failed to join TPP. And I think at this point, my last conversations in Washington, D.C. with people in Congress, there is a recognition that that might have been a strategic mistake, that we should have joined TPP. And hopefully we can come back to that conversation. But again, it right now is not the time, because it's just so, the relationship with China is just so toxic right now. We've just got these national security issues.
So this sounds like it's really the changing dynamics, maybe domestically in the United States as well as in China, but more so in the U.S., that, the idea of globalization and trade is just not as popular, right? And like you said, I'm surprised, not that you have to share, that there are actually people in Congress who would admit that not joining TPP is a mistake, but probably in private, not in public, right?
They make that admission in private, not in public, and I can't name names, but it's talked about more than you might think, and they are seeing that. They're having those kinds of conversations, that there was a strategic value in joining TPP and that we missed that. Now, having said that, even during when TPP was on the table, sort of in the last part of the Obama administration, a lot of those same Congress people were leaning towards TPP, but they couldn't do it politically. They couldn't do it publicly because of the politics of it. Again, it was sort of the voting public was not fully on board with trade and globalization. So that was the issue.
I think that was probably a better way to describe it, just the diversion between probably, the ruling elites and the mass in America, in terms of the view on trade and globalization, truly started around that time. And so I want to talk about also the Trump years, because that's how people view sort of truly the relationship, took a different direction. And you were the president, of AMCHAM in Shanghai, during the Trump years. So as America's business ambassador to China's commercial capital during sort of the downward spiral period of U.S.-China relationship, what were the biggest challenges?
Yeah, you're right. That was a challenging time, the Trump years. I mean, we had our issues during the Obama administration as well, but Trump was a challenge. I think it was mostly the erratic nature of the administration, and we were just trying to understand, what his end game was. Where was he really trying to end up in this relationship? But it was the erratic part of it. I mean, I can just tell you the story about, I'm sure you remember the WeChat, the WeChat event, and it was just so puzzling to us. I mean, literally, we woke up in the morning and found that President Trump had issued an executive order saying that using WeChat was a bad idea. And
so how did you explain to your Chinese counterparts? I'm sure they ask you probably all the time.
Oh, that was the least of our problems. My Chinese counterparts were laughing their heads off, because they saw they saw how this was just shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, we're worked so hard to get market access, and here you've got a company like Nike, say for example, that has worked so hard to get a foothold into this market, and then all of a sudden, our own president says we can't take payments from Chinese consumers. Because as you know, I mean, WeChat payment and other payment, that is simply the way people pay for products. And so the president says using WeChat is a bad idea. So, Nike's customers, can walk in the store, pick out a pair of shoes, they can't pay for them. So how fast do you think it takes them to walk 50 steps next door to Adidas and buy a pair of shoes. Adidas is not an American company; it's a German company, so they wouldn't be subject to that order. So, let alone Li-Ning, right? I mean, Li-Ning is the big competitor here as far as a domestic company. Yeah. They were laughing their heads off. But so no, the biggest problem was explaining this to the CEOs in my own membership, why our own president was going to shoot us in both feet, basically.
Yeah, and was it hard to represent U.S. Business interests during that time? What were the other challenges, especially as you had to deal with Chinese governments as well?
It was extremely difficult. I mean, the tariffs, for sure. I mean, because again, China business is complicated, right? So we're the global businesses that are located in China, and so we're affected by the inputs and the machinery, the technology that we need to bring in. All that's going to be, on a countervailing tariff, because China it retaliates. Mm-hmm. So it's a very different. I think the business community generally was not in favor of the tariffs. I mean, there was a very, very narrow group of business people in the United States. I think to some extent organized labor, and some of the businesses that were purely in markets that where they benefited from having these tariffs. So basically protecting their own markets. But the global companies, almost universally, really felt that the tariffs were really hampering us, and it certainly did a lot of damage to the overall relationship. There's no question about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing about the book I thought was, really a good read for anyone who liked to learn more about doing business in China, which we know is never easy. Even for many Taiwanese people who kind of pioneered of, setting up business entities in China, doing business there, can share lots of sort of stories of failed attempts. So the question comes down to, if it is so hard, is it really worth it, right? In other words, going back to your initial question, there are many benefits, but there are also many, I would say not so good benefits. I wouldn't call it benefits. And especially nowadays, the argument seems to be like, value-wise, national security is truly a challenge, right? So then why, right? Why should America do business with China?
It's a challenge. There's no question about it. And notice that we do have the word failures in the title of our book, because we're going to talk about that. But what we're trying to do with the book is try to help people to avoid those failures. But businesses do need to be mentally and financially prepared for failure in the China market, because it is so challenging. It's so competitive. Mm-hmm. I think you're right that at this point, with all of the different challenges, I think that some of the businesses, especially entrepreneurs and small, medium businesses, are going to be making choices that maybe the China market is not for them, if they don't have the deep pockets of the financial resources to weather through certain failures. I would argue, though, and we argue in the book, that for global companies, for the large businesses, it is a must. It's because basically, if you're a global company and you're not in the China market, the China market is so large, you're not global. You're not global. It's a fifth of the world, depending on how you want to look at it. So there's that. So the overall size of the market, even at the slower growth rates that we're going to see going forward, it's still going to be a must-have market from a size point of view. But what a lot of other people, what people may not be paying as much attention to, is that it's also a must-have market from the perspective of innovation, especially, and Bill Russo really goes into this point in detail in his chapter on automotive, is that there's so much innovation going on in China right now. So these global companies, if they're not in that market, they are not going to participate in that innovation. And their next global competitor, especially when you talk about automotive, their next global competitor is very likely going to be coming from China. And some of the Chinese OEMs are doing extraordinary things innovation, especially companies like NIO and XPeng. It's that they're quite remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you previously mentioned, when you edited this book with the other authors, you really wanted to talk about the role of government, right? We know the role of government in China is quite significantly larger than in many other countries. So, but you also argued that the role of business is separate from the role of government in the sense that American business in particular, in our domestic conversations, there's a lot of sort of value-oriented, impact that customers or consumers want to see, but it may not be the same in China. Can you maybe just say more about that? And that may also be the challenges of American businesses operating in China.
You're right. It is a big challenge, and it's a major point in the book. So I think it's good that we're coming back to this part of the discussion, and it's also a major point of misunderstanding, I think, between the United States and China, both at a policy level and at a business operations level. So, at the policy level, there's really this misunderstanding of kind of what the SOE, what the state-owned enterprises are about. And the conversation in Washington, D.C. these days is that, all businesses in China are all essentially state-owned enterprises. And there's a lot more nuance to it than that. As far as and the business operations, what's interesting is probably the most common failure of foreign CEOs or CEOs of foreign businesses in China is misunderstanding the importance of that government relations piece. And I would even go so far as to say that a large part of that job of being the CEO in China is managing that relationship with local government. And again, it's a question of understanding the plan, understanding the priorities, having those relationships with the government officials so that you understand how your business plan fits or doesn't fit within their priorities. And if it doesn't fit, you need to rethink that plan. But if it does fit and you're in sync with the government, then happy things can happen. And you can find that the government can actually be extremely helpful. As a banker, I did a lot of deal sourcing actually with government officials. I mean, I would go and visit them, ask them questions. I'd find out from them, which companies were doing well, which ones weren't, which companies might be for sale, which ones might be looking for a capital injection to finance their growth. I learned a lot from government officials, and they were extremely helpful to me. And it was a very much a symbiotic relationship. I also was able to bring a lot of capital into their districts, which helps them. They're interested in investment, jobs, and tax base. I mean, that's what their KPIs are really all about.
But essentially, if there's a tension between sort of company values or how they talk about their values and the Chinese government perhaps priorities, what do you do?
Well, it depends on what we mean by values. I mean, it's obviously politics has to stay out of this, right? And I've had those conversations. Fortunately, I mean, that's part of what the American Chamber of Commerce does is kind of shields the member companies from those kinds of conversations. I've had really difficult conversations with the foreign ministry in Beijing about Xinjiang, about the accusations about forced labor and this human rights, and they would very much like to drag me into the middle of that conversation and get me to quote unquote talk some sense into my own government, which of course is just not something that I'm interested in doing. Right. So there are those kinds of awkward conversations, but again, that's what the chamber does, and tries to sort of shield our members from those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, it's not an easy task for sure. And are you still optimistic about doing business in China for foreign companies, in particular American?
Well, I'm an optimist by nature, but I think it is going to be a challenge. I do think that there's going to continue to be opportunities in the China market. I think that especially the large businesses, again, the smaller businesses may have different choices to make. But I think to a large extent, there are decisions that are being made right now, especially in Beijing, about what does the future look like. What's the structure of this economy going to be? Again, as we talked about, this reform and opening up, the policies that were put in place by Deng Xiaoping and a lot of good decisions beyond that, good decisions, good policies, investment in infrastructure. A lot of those things have led to an amazing growth story, and incomes have gone up. So I think the future could actually still be a China that is highly integrated with the rest of the world, highly integrated with American markets and European markets. But as we know, self-sufficiency has also been part of the plan from the beginning. And so I think there's choices being made now as to which side they emphasize. I'm hoping that there are a lot of more practical decisions, practical people in the government. But China is full of smart, hardworking, innovative people. I think they can have a good future either way. But I think it's a choice. There are choices that need to be made.
Yeah, so I think the big question for Washington, D.C. and perhaps in the U.S. is, what is a better strategy to be more competitive, right? So, well, thank you so much for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room today. We'll be looking forward to the book when it's out in August. And most importantly, thank you for playing this instrumental role in bridging US and China and helping each other side to understand each other. So take care.
Thank you very much.